now begin with a session titled Inclusive Philanthropy for Inclusive Development, a Myth or Reality. In this session, leaders from the funding community and social purpose organizations will have an open and honest conversation about what inclusive philanthropy entails for them, the challenges they face, and how they navigate those. It will be moderated by Urvi Shriram, lead at the Center of Philanthropy for Inclusive Development of the Global Knowledge Hub at ISDM. Urvi, I welcome you to begin the session.
Thank you, Mariam. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us for this discussion. Over the next 50 minutes, we're going to unpack a very daunting and complex topic, inclusive philanthropy, what it really means, what are the challenges faced by both funders as well as social purpose organizations when it comes to adopting inclusive practices, and what are some of the best practices that can be adopted by both. We're honored to have 8 really amazing, leaders with us here today to debate on and to dissect this topic. We have Sudarshan Suchi, CEO of Bal Raksha Bharat, Shaveta, CEO and MD of Central Square Foundation, Pradyut Bhattacharjee, Executive Director of SESTA, and Sangeeta Bhattacharya from Dasra to share the non-profits or the SPO side perspectives. On this side, we have Matilda Lobo, Head of CSR at Indocent. We've got Shipra Saxena, CSR Manager at the Transworld Group, Neelima Khetan, CSR and Social Sector Advisor, and Riti Mohapatra, Partner at the Britspan Group. A very warm welcome to all of you. I think we all agree that there's a huge need and opportunity for private philanthropy to enable large-scale social change in the country. And that's not just because of its financial weight, but because of the independence that it has, because of its ability to take risks which many times markets and government are not able to do. Yet we see that philanthropy's role is often restricted by a lack of data, by some sort of aversion to risk, by certain geographical and sector biases, inherent power dynamics between funders on the one hand and the recipients on the other hand, and at times an organization's own internal leadership, as well as internal operating structures. So I want to actually begin by asking you all first, what are your thoughts on inclusive philanthropy? Do you think philanthropic practices are inclusive? And when they're not so inclusive, then what are challenges that you face on the ground? Any order? Yeah. Can start. Yeah, any order. This discussion will be like an open conversation, so I leave it to all of you to, just be honest, stop each other, reflect on what everyone is saying, all of that.
So I come from Northeast. I based out of Guwahati and work with an organization called SESTA. We are working with livelihoods, institution building, and natural resource management. So I think it's not an either or, it's I think a complementary role that both not-profits like us and also the donors would play to each other. Especially for a region like Northeast, comprising of 8 states, I think the data show that in the last 2-3 years, the overall percentage of CSR money, at least CSR, not even the other philanthropy, but CSR money is barely 4% or 5% of the entire kitty. But if you see, there are pockets. Although by demography-wise, it's not very big region. But if you leave aside Assam, which is around 3.3 crore population, other 7 states would not have very big, for example, Nagaland has just 10 lakhs population. Same with, say, Mizoram. But the challenges are very varied. I think it's not as homogeneous. I had worked with an organization called Pradhan in Jharkhand and Chhattisgarh, where there was 1 or 2 agroclimatic zones. But in Assam, for example, there are 7 agroclimatic zones. There are a lot of different vagaries. Among the climate change, I think the districts which are climate change affected, I think in Assam and other parts of Northeast, I think almost all the districts, maybe around 13-14 districts will come under extreme vulnerable districts. You see the kind of heterogeneity. In Arunachal itself, there are 72 different kind of tribes and sub-tribes. So I think the models, if we have to make it truly inclusive, cannot be one model fit all. Now, some of the challenges that we face, probably we will discuss in length more, is that there is a issue around scale. Like in areas like say Jharkhand, Chhattisgarh, Orissa, the donors might talk about scale, what is the outreach that you are looking at? maybe it can come to thousands. But in places like, say, Nagaland, Mizoram, where population is so sparsely populated, the scale is not there. Then the cost, because of the transportation issues, the communication issues, the cost at times, the per unit cost becomes very high. Like when we promote livelihoods in Assam, in the plain areas, in order to promote, say, piggery with one farmer, the same cost would be around 2 to 3 times in places like Nagaland or Manipur. Similarly, I think the stages of the NGOs, stages of the CSO there, I think we are far behind, or we do not have that exposure of a organization development comprehensive processes. There are so many programs now going on, but I think most of the projects, they do not have that inbuilt OD component there. Even if it is OD, it is sometimes mostly around awareness or like that. So I think there are these issues, I think, which I think we can have more discussion. But I would say that I think the donors are also coming up, and they are also sensitive to these issues right now.
Thanks, Pradyut. I think just to the point on is philanthropy inclusive enough, right? I think the honest answer is no, right? But has there been movement? For sure, right? So I think that way when we had to, a lot of what Pradyut already spoke about, I think the fact that remains that very recently, if we look at the India Philanthropy Report, we still see that a large chunk of the funds are still going towards issues and sectors like education, like healthcare, right? Now, again, it's not to say that the needs are not there, but those may not be the only needs, right? So I think from the philanthropic side, 2-3 things if I had to kind of point out. The first is, can we shift the preference of priorities from a very top-down approach to going by the actual lived realities of the communities, right, where issues are. The second part is also equally important, I think, is that there is not enough long-term and flexible funding that's coming from the system that we know is a huge gap, right, at the moment. And I think another point is just, can we reduce the gap of this perceived issue and understanding, which is so contextual in a place like India. And I think if we can enable more platform for the philanthropic ecosystem to be exposed to those realities, I think these 2-3 things in my mind will make the system more inclusive.
Thank you. Should we just continue? Yeah. So when we were setting up CSF, we work in school education now almost 11 and a half years ago. A lot of people in the sector would talk about how does it feel like to be in one of the happening sectors in philanthropy? And education continues to be that. So I'm sharing perspective from being a part of a sector which actually does get disproportionate funding. But even within our work, I mean, are we truly inclusive even within the sectors which is getting the capital? Within that, are we looking for more linear, programmatic, replicable solutions? Or are we truly willing to go at a deeper institutional system reform level, right? So inclusivity, I think, has to be addressed at different levels. Is the sector inclusive? Is the issue or the approach within the sector inclusive? Are we reaching all geographies? I think another important aspect becomes, are we reaching all different types of organizations and leadership teams, right? Like, I think one fairly cliched critique about our work, and I think we should also be honest in accepting, is that there's a certain prototype of organizations and entrepreneurs and leadership teams which are more effective in fundraising than others are. And I think all of these need to be put forward. And of course, right, I mean, I think the first principle is there is not a either or, right? Like, it's not like the funders have to solve it and the CSOs can't solve it. We'll have to together begin with acknowledging that there's an issue, have the risk appetite to be bold about certain things, to pick a different way of doing things, to pick a more challenging geography, which today doesn't have the critical mass, but how do you build it? And I think at some level it will require a deep amount of trust, because the gestation cycle will be longer. A more predictable programmatic model in a district in UP can get us results, if not in 2 years, in 3 or 4 years. But even if we were to pick a more challenging issue, and today climate change would probably fall in that category, right? What's the data and evidence we can get on climate change, where there is half the world still debating whether climate change is an issue worth putting money behind? So let's acknowledge it. Let's be bold about it. And I think we need both sides of the table in a way, right? The operating organizations as well as the donor organizations, to say a part of the effort, at least a proportion of the effort, will go towards being inclusive. I think we also have to keep in mind that there's a business and regulatory side in which all of us operate. So the tables can't turn overnight. But can we at least start accounting for that in the way forward?
So the very topic, inclusive philanthropy and inclusive development, I think are, if not an absolute myth, they are almost a myth. And the very contradiction in this is, it almost sounds condescending that somebody else who's living a problem needs to be included in your plans. So which means right from the beginning, we have made up our mind that how to include rather than how to ground ourselves into a context. So I think all those rows, columns, cells or parcels are created by us, that I will, we are going to focus on education, within education, early childhood. We are going to focus on health, within health, only immunization. And which means we have found solutions before we have lived the problem. And I would say a typical family on the margin or brink faces everything together, all of it and everything at all the time. There is a vulnerability. So if there is, I think, an absolute commitment, then I would turn the inclusive around to how inclusive all of us are, would be on both sides of you, to mold ourselves around the agenda of what is required to be done on ground. That requires a huge mind shift and a huge generosity on our part and a huge capability building. Because, we just first ground starting with ourselves. We put ourselves first and then started, and I think the script goes wrong there. And then we find reasons why something failed. That reasons are normally ascribed to those whom we wanted to include. They never included us. And that's why in all these decades we are still where we were earlier.
Thank you. Thanks for such useful and very frank and honest insights. I want to move to this side now. Any reflections on the challenges that you've heard, and also want to ask you, what are some of the practical challenges that funding organizations face? While sitting on ivory towers, we can talk about it's very important to have participatory practices. It's very important to have unrestricted funding, flexible funding. But any practical, and when it comes to practically implementing these things, what are the challenges that you all have faced in your organizations?
So as head of CSR at IndusInd Bank, I think I will delve into the challenges faced by corporates. We all know that 2014, the CSR was mandated in India. I feel the first country to do that. So that was a big tick box, right? But fast forward into Jan 21, there were amendments which were, brought into place by MCA, which made it very much regulated and stringent in terms of compliance, where the ownership now and accountability lies at the board level. So now the board, in addition to maximizing shareholder value, has also to look into how well are we implementing the CSR mandate. So there are penalties at every level. So I don't know, any of you all know that if you don't spend that year, you have penalties at the officer level, the company secretary, the CFO, MD, and at the board level. So you can understand if somebody is, put that responsibility, then that person is going to be on the back foot and trying to be a little bit conservative when they're going to implement CSR. So this is one challenge. The other challenge is that the good part and the bad part. Initially, CSR was more like a donation, right? But with the organically evolvement of CSR, now it is talking about 1+3 years project. But when you're talking about projects at grassroots, when you talk about inclusion, right? And you're talking about projects in water or soil or climate, you will not see change even in 15 years, right? So it's quite a short span in terms of the timelines that have been given for implementing CSR projects. So these are some of the constraints that are faced by corporates. Now, in addition to that, you said that you have to do an impact assessment of the project, right? So when you have to do an impact assessment of the project, it has to depend on data, the beneficiaries, and in turn, the type of reporting which is there also in the corporate world, right? Every corporate, it's all related to the stock market. You're reporting quarter on quarter, right? And that same mindset then comes down to CSR, because you have to report outcomes at the end of the year. You have to report it at your board level. You have to report it in your annual report. Plus, in addition to that, you have to also report now to MCA. And this is like total detail, line by line projects that you are doing as part of CSR. So the challenge is not only at the end of the implementing partner. I feel as an ecosystem, we all are facing this issue because as I need to report, I then need that information coming from the implementing partner, and I'll seek that information from the implementing partner. So it's very important that how do we work cohesively, to ensure that whatever limited resources and funds we have, because I feel resources in terms of money is very scarce in our country, and the problems are too many. When we're talking about education, what Shaveta mentioned, that even though education gets a bigger chunk of the funding, it still needs so much to do on the systemic changes, right? So most of the organizations, then the board will focus on something is seeing is believing. So what can I immediately see? I will focus on that. And the other aspect is that even CSR talks about implementing programs in the geographies that you operate. Now coming to what some of my friends on the podium mentioned, that closer to the customer. Now there's two ways to look at it, right? If you're doing it where you have a plant, you are actually much closer to the customer, right? Because then you know what the problem is. But on the other side, the organizations like bank, like from where I come from, I'm location agnostic. I don't have a plant, so I can do projects anywhere. But I'm totally dependent on the implementing partner who is my eyes and ears to actually get the story from the ground, right? What is the problem statement? What is required? What are the type of inputs? Other thing is that to make it more effective, I think whatever gets measured gets done, right? So if we can track and get down to the theory of change, saying that what all we require to do in terms of the activities, what are the inputs required on various fronts? Like me as a corporate, what do I get on the table in terms of my strength? What does the implementing partner get? What does technology and innovation get? Cohesively, what are the inputs? What are the outputs? What are the outcomes? And what are the long-term impacts? What are the behavioral changes, right? But all this thing has to be tracked. And we don't track it just to report. There's a huge course correction that can happen during the course of the project, right? COVID happened. If people didn't have this cohesive approach to working together in a collaborative manner, we wouldn't be able to solve some of the problems during COVID. So I feel these are some of the challenges that corporates face when it comes to stringent regulation. Then in terms of selecting the geographies, because how many corporates are there in Northeast, right? The most of the corporates are in Maharashtra, Delhi, that belt. So you need the management, the board to really think beyond the fence. And that's a big ask, right? Because you're not already managing your internal stakeholders in terms of your employees, your senior management, your board, but you're looking at investors, you're looking at shareholders. Today at every AGM, we get questioned, what are you doing on your CSR? Why are you doing a project here? And now the big buzzword, ESG. So that's where, the S comes in. So what are you doing and how are you relating it with climate? Now please show us the linkages. So all of us are getting questioned a lot. So yes, and I think collectively, most of us are working in a collaborative fashion, but there's a long way to go, long way to go.
Shipra, do you resonate with some of the things again coming
Yes,
from
a
the
lot.
corporate side?
Yes, a lot. I think Matilda has kind of put it all together. Just to add to what Matilda just said, I think when we talk of inclusion, we were talking about that how 99% of funding goes to only 1% of organizations. And, how do you identify that 1%? Because if they were getting that sort of funding, they would be visible everywhere. So to identify that right organization at the grassroots level is a big challenge, because definitely that organization needs a lot more capacity building, a lot more hand-holding to come up and look out for that funding. And I think that's where, we try to focus as an organization, look at innovative organizations, more grassroots organizations doing good work. Even when you identify those organizations, sometimes the challenge is regulatory requirements. The work is good, amazing work is happening, but maybe they don't have the capacity to get the right infrastructure or the right paperwork, right documentation. So I think that is one point which is very, very critical. Second is when you talk of inclusion of who, right? I mean, so what about the participants or the beneficiaries? Are we including them in the programs or everything that we put together? So, and I think there's been a history of doing like having a top-down approach where there is a funding organization funding a project, there's an implementing organization, assessing and doing the work that they need to do. But are we involving the real people for whom you're solving the problem? Are we including them? So I think that is something that, as both the implementing organizations, SPOs, and the funding organizations should come together and just broaden this, circle of inclusion. So I think that's, for me, I think we need to look at as well.
Thanks. I'm glad I'm sitting in between because as Britspan, we're connecting both sides as well. I think a lot of what everyone said resonated, and having the perspective on being in conversations on both sides, I'll sort of underscore a few things that resonated strongly. I think if we look at the definition of inclusion, I think everyone has a very different understanding of what that means. Not that it's a bad thing. I think it's a good thing. I think we all spoke about the need for data and narrative change to strengthen what that means for a broader audience. And I think from a funding perspective, different funders can look at it differently. If you talk about CSR, just given the compliance burden, I think it's a longer journey to traverse. So maybe inclusion is about geography. Inclusion is about disaggregation of data of impact across marginalized communities to understand whether the work that we're doing is actually having impact for the population in totality or just for a small segment, and you have to redesign program keeping that in mind. One example that has resonated with me very strongly over the years is a program on rural electrification that happened a few years ago, where at the time of designing the program, the thought around how the laying of the wire was never a concern, right? It's only in retrospect that program designers realized that just because they didn't put thought into the design stage, all the wiring and all the connections actually happened in the privileged parts of villages. And the Dalit Vadas stayed out of the impact benefit, right? Similarly, there are multiple organizations that do skilling, placement, thinking about how to have an expansive program that also addresses what other challenges marginalized communities might face. And building that into the program might be something to think about in inclusion. Whereas for foundations, HNIs, they might be able to play some of the more riskier catalytic roles and rally support of others. So I just wanted to say that different paths of inclusion for different entities.
Thank you very much. So just to build on this conversation, so maybe I'll take one step further back in this inclusion conversation. So to me, the idea of inclusion begins from the idea of, I think Sudarshan touched upon that a little bit, about from the point of who is doing the prioritization, or at what level is the prioritization being done. And within that, one distinct shift that has occurred in the last, I would say, 20 years definitely, and more markedly in the last 10 years, that instead of having the community at the center of that prioritization of the problem, it has now become themes that have moved at the center of the prioritization. So the conversation once upon a time used to be, what is it that we need to do to support this community, to empower this community, to make this community, and within that, geography would always be a constraint, that whether you will work here or there. But within any geography that a donor chose, you were talking about a community. Now, within any geography that you've chosen, you will speak about, in education, what is it that can be done? In health, what can be? Within health, what can you do in malaria? Or what can you do in polio? Or what can you do? So I'm just saying that one big shift that has occurred to me is that we are no longer talking about communities, but we're talking about themes. And to me, the first kind of separation from people, from what we want to do I don't know, you mentioned that, when you, or one of you mentioned, when you work with the poor, there's no separation that health is important or education is important or agriculture is. Today one thing may be important, tomorrow the other thing may be important. So do you have the community in your perspective, or do you not have so that's one level. The second is, I think, of course, the nature of donors has changed, like you mentioned. And of course, every donor comes with its own DNA. So money carries the DNA of that donor. And so there were donors in the past who had and so today, most of the conversation, unfortunately, is happening around the CSR kind of donors. And that, like Matilda said, has a different kind of a different constituency that you are accountable to. So I just, not to take up too much time, just 2 points that I want to make within that. Even within the frame of CSR, which is the most limited kind of money that's available, even within that, one, I feel that we've made compliance, we tend to, my feeling is, having worked in CSR, I think we've made compliance more important and more kind of a bogey, to be afraid of than it actually is or should be. There is space within that, even before these last set of amendments came in. When the Act was rolled out in 2013, the Act was very open-ended. I remember the minister came to one of the CII meetings early years, the minister was, and people asked him, tell us where can we spend the money, because there were just these Schedule 7 listed these activities. He said, it doesn't matter to me if, as a corporate, as a respected corporate, you think your CSR is about livelihood creation, you do that. If you think within whatever your CSR is doing a langar and distributing puri and aloo, you do that. I am not judging it. Your peers will judge you. All that I'm asking is, put it in your report, whatever you've done. So even at that time, when there was so much space, all that we wanted to ask him was, nahi, par aap define kariye, isme kya hoga? And all these years, and I moved into CSR in 2012, before it became a law. And I know all these years, I've seen my colleagues in the CSR space just keep asking the ministry, nahi, aap isko specify kariye. नहीं ये कर सकते कि नहीं. So we keep asking the government, please tell us, can you, and the government is telling you, no, you decide. But we are more risk averse than any other category of people that I know. सरकार ने इतना बोला है तो हम उसको इतना करके करेंगे, नहीं इतना भी नहीं लेंगे. So I'm just saying that we need to take responsibility and take some decisions, we keep talking about the entrepreneurial mindset. We should say, this is how we interpret it. And this is, as long as your auditor is okay with it, and you said this, and we have to, CSR is positioned in between this world and that world. And if we are not going to educate the other world and only ask that world to get educated and understand कि देखिए मेरी लाचारी ये है, that's okay, they will understand your lachari because they want the money. But we also have to educate them on this side of the boardroom that, that world doesn't. So I'm just saying that there is this, we have to think about our role as kind of the interpreters between these two worlds, and to differing degrees, like we were speaking earlier, and I feel Matilda has done a great job in this interpreting. Many professionals have. But I'm saying, if we think that our role is a easy role, then of course forget about it. But if we think our role is on both sides, like you said, we have to help the non-profits learn a different way of working, but we also have to get the boardrooms understand a different way of working.
Thank you. I think some of the challenges that we've heard are, leading to certain recurring patterns or behaviors in the ecosystem. For example, this whole preference towards, as you mentioned, results-driven, compliance-driven approach, preferences of certain themes and sectors. And while we are constrained by, regulatory restrictions as well, many a times it's our own actions and our own mental models and behaviors which are also leading to things being, the way they are. And that is often leading to, just addressing the symptoms of a lot of social problems, but not really getting to the root causes because of the patterns and the way the brain is wired to react to those. So I want to actually now request you all to, share some examples of, how you've been able to break some of these patterns, some of these behaviors, and how do you really make, philanthropy focus on underfunded causes, geographies, issues. Any order.
So I'm going to take the liberty to shift focus while being on this into a generally otherwise lesser focused thing which contributes a lot on both sides. You know, it's the HR policies of organizations. How it goes contradictory is typically every organization has performance appraisals. You can frame performance appraisal. So let's say if it is the donor organization, it can talk about scale, spread, technology. How much of what you did is more. So the persons, engaging with program, their solutions start to perform better. These are the things I have to deliver. I've got to spend 50 crores, got to spend it in 6 months, and got to have the impact and this thing. And similarly, the program implementing organization would have HR policies which would be totally insensitive to inclusion, to people building, capacity building, and all. But everybody today talks in the narrative of output, outcome, and impact. And before you close your eyes and open, everything else has to happen. And it does happen, at least in Excel and PowerPoint. And that's where I think the everything else kind of gets shaken. So that myth we live in and satisfy ourselves from there. And I do think it hugely contributes. And if we could turn that around, if people's job roles, performance appraisals could happen around actually transformative change, relationship at ground level, and that be accounted for, maybe we'll see a big change.
Sudarshan, again, more in the spirit of the fishbowl format that we are trying to follow. I mean, I love the idea, but I also genuinely feel the sector started like that, right? Like, where community was at the center. And then, I mean, we can't also diminish the regulatory pressure or this whole data orientation or this whole metric measurement orientation, which is why we've come where we've landed. I mean, and I'm just, curious to hear, is there a perspective of what that right balance could be, right? Where community, and also the honest truth is, I think one of the panelists brought up caste, right? If we truly unpack inclusion, how many of us are even comfortable talking about it, right? Inclusion at a gender level, I think, is now quite, everyone's comfortable with that currency. But when it comes to Dalit right, when it comes to Muslims, when it comes to underrepresented communities, and I think in that context, just curious to hear if any of us have had an experience of being able to strike that balance where the whole data orientation is also the reality of the sector. And the honest reality is I don't think it's going to go away anytime soon. The whole transformative approach still has to be able to fit into, like Matilda said, a board feels it's their neck on the line if it's not delivering impact.
But to answer this, I think it's a double whammy. So I've seen things switch to the positive side. So with this whole ownership coming to the board level, they actually started questioning, saying that let's revisit our CSR strategy. So in late December 2020 and early 2021 is where we did a total revisit of our CSR strategy and said that how are we actually working and in an inclusive manner. So where we are looking at differently abled, we're looking at women, and we're looking at tribals, scheduled class, scheduled tribes. So now this is agnostic to all our programs, right? The other aspect was, let's keep community at the center. Let's go bottoms up. And that's what we did in case of our aspirational district project. We said instead of reinventing, so in terms of how we select the project, we said there's some work which is already done by the government of India. There was Tata Trust, Bill Melinda Gates Foundation, which worked on the Champion of Change dashboard. There's enough data which is there. Look at even secondary data, and then identify district's aspirational district. And what Neelima and what has been mentioned before, that there's a connection circle. It's not about only education. It's not about water. It's not about health. Everything is linked, right? So you can't say that you can only solve a problem of education and that will just solve the problem there for that family or household. And that's the lens that we bought. And we said, let's go bottoms up. So we got a lot of data. Then we identified NGOs who are working in that particular district. So we didn't want an NGO who is working in saying that I'm in UP or I'm in Delhi, but I have all the capabilities. I have that strategic outlook, and I will go and work for you in Bahraich or in Bara. So we looked at, organizations who are predominantly strong and working with the district administration, working with the state, because we cannot have a parallel narrative at the district level, right? We have to sink in with what is the need at the district level. So that is the thought process that we brought in. And we got really good partners like Pradhan, WOTR, Aga Khan to be like an anchor partner. And we got into a consortium model because we know that their strength is in livelihood or when it comes to water related. But we need hyperlocal organizations in those districts who will work on the other issues, right? And like what is mentioned, that there's a cherry picking in terms of thematics. But the way we looked at it is water and soil in an agrarian society cuts across all the problem social issues. Yeah. So we said, let's put our maximum investment there and then look at farm-based and non-farm-based livelihood. And this we could do it because we had a third-party consultant or an aggregator who had enough of information or data from the ground and through secondary data who could help us in assessing as to where is the actual need for us intervening, and also help us in identifying the right partners. And then the right partners helped us in finding out the hyperlocal partners. Now, yes, we are trying to, align with the district administration, look at data points, how we can track the progress so that we can do a course correction and create a pilot. So very important is like how board, actually views it. And as CSR heads, it's our responsibility to just not follow the pack, but try to look at how we can do things beyond, right? And I feel if there's an intention, if you want to create impact and you are wanting to, work for the community, I feel the board will see the value and will sign off. So that's been my experience.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to add to your point. I think year before last, we did this report on social mobility for India's Dalits and Adivasis. And we spoke to about 40 proximate leaders. Across conversations, the request was, do for Dalits and Adivasis what has already been done for gender. Like there's gender in conversation, maybe action will follow intent, but the conversation itself is not happening. Matilda, to your point, I think we are seeing a subset of funders follow the approach that you are saying. It's community-driven change. Instead of taking our definition of development to the community, understanding and sort of first starting with treating communities as assets and not deficient in something, understanding their priorities, and then designing something that works in their context. We are seeing some funders sort of start to take that approach. They are not your big funders. They are some of the smaller ones who are trying some of these things on the ground in different parts of the country, but largely saying bottom up, right? Yeah. I'm not walking in saying this should happen to you. We should work out together. One of the things that we are realizing though is a lot of the nonprofits that actually work in this space find it very difficult to market this as a strength. Because funders ask them, ठीक है, आप ये सब कर रहे हो, but education में impact क्या है? The fact that you are building a community's power and assets is not impact, not traditional impact. Yeah. Where is the impact? So that's something that we're trying to also solve with nonprofits and with funders, saying, how do you talk about impact in settings like this, where problems are actually long-term? Yeah. Everything is flexible. You're working on like 3 different things at the same time. Today, it's something else tomorrow. And how do you see that as true path to impact versus saying education, livelihoods, health, but a more cohesive agenda.
So on this note, in fact, this bottom-up approaches and how do you really include communities, I want to actually bring in Pradyut, because you're not only working in, the traditionally underfunded geographies, but also, women, in really, really remote communities, even within those geographies. So any examples of how do you do this at, SESTA?
So I think like these issues about inclusion and how do we get good partners on ground. I think one important thing which we are also missing in say Northeast or in most cases are also the rigor in the field. For a non-profit like us also, I think the quality of work that we do, and it's not quality versus quantity. Whether you can work both, we can scale also with quality, but the rigor of work and that approach of transformational. Like many times we have seen like many organizations are into very transactional kind of work, which is very short term. So for that, I think that donor education, working with the donors, engaging with the donors, that this requires a long term investment. So that I think that mandate from the NGOs and not profits should also be there. So in our cases, we have made it very clear to our partners, and there have been cases that the partners wanted to also impose certain things, but we said very clearly that no, for us, this transformational, this enabling, this agency enhancement of women, we have made very clear that we will work with women, and also among the women, this 30 to 40% has to be ultra poor, and we have defined like what does ultra poor means on the basis of their resource base, on the basis of their skill set, and also what will be the poor. And only around 10% of the total outreach, we are now currently working with 1.5 lakh households. Out of that, maybe 10% will be well off, the people having say more than 10 bighas of land. Maybe they are the well off progressive, but our significant focus has to be on the poor and the ultra poor. And how do we also build on their knowledge, skills, and attitudes? How do we make planning processes which are decentralized, which are very participatory? So what we have tried to do in whenever we are doing livelihood planning, we are engaging with the women, enhancing their skill sets, enhancing their knowledge, so that they are in a position to take decisions in the family, not just a token kind of thing, just a representative member as being a part of the self-help group, but they are in a position to take this thing. But for that, I think a lot of rigor, that grassroots presence is very important. I think it cannot be a one-day kind of thing. It has to be a lot of like investment. The other thing I think what we also need to think of as civil societies is, are we also looking at convergence? Because if you are only focusing on say philanthropy money or donor money, that also has its own limitations. But if we can unlock the panchayat money, if we can unlock the money lying out there from all this government, this thing, so much can be done actually. We are working on livelihood promotion. For that, this asset building. So for example, if we are to promote say aquaculture, how much money the donor can give for constructing ponds. But from Narega, I think there is so much of possibilities. But we come from a cynical mindset, which we need to change, is that panchayats are corrupt, they are inefficient, they will not give us that kind of thing. So I think as a non-profit, we also have to change our stance. The last thing I think we work, when we talk about thematic work, we non-profits are also working so much in silos. Like how many networks are working? Many of the networks are not working beyond the project. After that, I think there is not much synergy among them. So can we also work in convergence within ourselves, sector agnostic, within the same region? Now, in many of the aspirational districts, there are so many NGOs working, but if you ask us also, even ask them also, what are each other doing? Is there any scope of overlapping or building on? I don't think so. There is also rivalry and competition. So I think that also needs to be addressed, and convergence with the government programs, with communities, and keeping the communities in the center. Yeah. So I think we talk about PRA, we talk about a lot of this thing, but we seldom practice it. Now I think PRA is a very I think it's people say that it's very old fashioned. Why we need to do PRA? But even now when I go and do these wealth ranking exercises, we know very participatory who is the poor in the village. They are themselves, they are saying. If we do a resource mapping, we did not have very high-tech GIS mapping and all that. Even a simple resource mapping, the villagers are able to say where are the problems and where are the things. So I think what I believe is that the donors also have to invest on the human resource. Now another problem that I see, that the people who are coming out from colleges freshers, they are the ones who are also designing projects and implementing. But I would rather want that our young colleagues also go and stay in the villages, listen to them. I think we have stopped doing active listening, which is much more needed actually.
Thank you.
Yeah, go respond ahead. Not respond, but some of what you said just triggered. So two quick. So one that you said on convergence, government funds should be. So my only word of caution here is, that if convergence now becomes the new God, what you said just now, let's say some things like working with Dalits or with the tribals, or so that may not unlock any money from the government. Huh? That's an issue that has to be done, and probably money will only need to be put in from the donor side or somebody else with very little money come. So if the metric became tomorrow, how much money have you unlocked from the government? Because very quickly these conversations will degenerate into metrics, and metrics that are applied. So I'm just saying to be cautious before we get on to any of these. And the second that I want to say is this silo and rivalry and competition. So first of all, I disagree with that. I don't think the natural proclivity amongst non-profits is of competing more than the proclivity towards competition in the rest of society. The second point that I want to say within that, I think the onus for creating a context within which competition goes down and collaboration increases, the onus rests more on the donor than on the non-profit. And I've seen that. So non-profits come together so much. Now, I worked in for-profits and corporates. Corporates do the kind of coming together. They also come together when they want to get some policies changed, some laws changed. So CII, FICCI, all of them will do that. Non-profits, by the way, also come together when they want, so whether it was the right to information, whether it was NRE, GA. So you can give dozens of examples at least in independent India when non-profits came together, and because of their coming together, Vishakha, when it happened. So all of those changes have happened because non-profits across the country collaborated and came together spontaneously in the absence of any large membership-driven body, but it was the cause that brought them together. And the second point that I'm saying, often I feel we create donors, we create an artificial condition in which people have to compete. And I'm saying, why don't we create conditions under which there is not competition like that, where people, and I've worked with donors also now, speaking from that side, who have done both. I've known of donors who have created even more division, and I've worked with donors who have brought people together in the best. So I'm just saying those labels kind of upset me, because they have now begun to stick more and more. People loosely just say, oh, NGOs, they can't collaborate. What nonsense. The amount of collaboration that's happened in the non-profit space, the for-profit space cannot even imagine that kind of collaboration.
Yeah. Thank you. Shipra, you wanted to
Yeah,
add
I just want
something
to add
before
to
we
what
close.
you just said. I think, for us, when we look at it, for collaboration, we also look at value alignment. So I think, where there is an alignment of values, and when there is an alignment of an idea that you are coming together to solve a problem together, I think collaboration falls in very beautifully. And we've seen it in some of our projects where, one of the project strength has actually supported challenges being faced by another organization. So I think it's as a donor, it's also our responsibility to assess that, where we can bring in one organization's strengths to kind of pitch in to support the other organization. And I think that's something that we've done in a couple of our projects very successfully. So I totally agree with you that, I think it's when the values come in together, and the intent of putting together problem-solving attitude, it can be done. Another thing, picking up from the whole community aspect, is a very interesting example was, we were looking, as a shipping and logistics company, we were looking at a project for marine conservation. And we thought, okay, let's solve a problem for, marine environment. And we started looking at a project for olive ridley turtle conservation. And Orissa was the place where, where we identified the project. And then we realized that maybe our priorities are not right. To get the environment protected, what is the priority of the community? And it turned out livelihood was a major challenge and major priority. So when we included livelihood into the conservation, I think the project fell so beautifully together. And I think it's one of the flagship projects that, so it's rightly pointed out that, how do you prioritize and look at community priorities and look at problem solving, and then definitely one area can easily move into the other area as well.
Thank you.
Urvi, if I may, and
Yeah, sure.
Neelima, thank you for also pointing out that there has been evidence, over the evolution of the sector where NGOs have organically, spontaneously come together to become the collective voice for the issue. But I just want to underline the fact that the incentive to collaborate in actually working, I think as a sector, we do still need funders and donors to enable that.
Agreed.
Yeah, I think that's the point, right? That when a donor plays that role, when the donor is looking for similar values but complementarity of skills and value add, and is able to look at intersection of organizations becoming partners, I think that is where maybe that sense of competition is what NGOs do feel. And again, as the regulation and data and impact and reporting is becoming more complicated, that does add that additional pressure. But donors can provide that incentive. Nothing else in the ecosystem actually incentivizes the programmatic collaboration.
Yeah, thank you. I think 50 minutes were too less to unpack such a hugely complex topic, but we really hope that, all the examples, best practices shared here today fuel healthy debates within, many more organizations and inspire action for all of you. But thank you all for joining us for this session. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
For the insights.
Thank you so much. I think a huge round of applause because this is the first session that actually finished dot on time. Thank you, Urvi. Thank you, all the speakers. So I would now like to invite Urvi to felicitate all our panelists as a token of our gratitude and appreciation. While you're gearing up to give them the gift bags, I would speak a little about the gift. So the certificate presented to our speakers marks a small planet forward step. A tiny forest is being created at the Devambar Dham, Kashipur, Uttarakhand by a forest institute. Their mission is to bring back lost forests by creating them. So I'll just randomly call out the speakers. We'll first have Riti. Thank you so much, Riti. So we have a group photo in the end. Yeah. Okay. So if all the speakers and the moderator can come together in front for a photograph, and then. So everyone in the audience, don't be puzzled. They've agreed to take the gift bags backstage. अगर आपको लग रहा हो एक ने ले लिया है, बाकियों का क्या हो रहा है? Thank you so much. Thank you.